I was living in a junkyard in Fullerton, California. It was not a real junkyard but a property littered with broken-down cars and tires. It was a lot like Sanford and Son. I just gave away my age. It was right next to the railroad and switching yard, so there were no sound ordinances on this property. You could run a chainsaw when the diesels were smashing cars together, and nobody would hear anything. There was a new owner to the property next to where I was living, and it soon became apparent this guy was running a chop shop as car carriers were dropping cars in the alley at 3 a.m. They were pushing them all into his backyard, and when the first light hit it sounded like an auto shop over there with all the air wrenches. A truck came by every few hours, and the extra parts were thrown on the truck under a tarp, and they would drive off quickly. By late in the day they were painting the finished cars. I made the mistake of shooting off my mouth in the local bar about this turn of events, and before I knew it the local gang was trying to drive me out. I was living in a truck camper without the truck that had been dragged on a trailer as far back behind the garage as I could get it. They started with young kids letting my dog out while I was gone to work. It escalated to harassment such as yelling, "That's where he hides his tools." How could they see me locking up my tools? I wondered. The yard was surrounded by a 7-foot-high solid painted plywood fence. I scanned the perimeter with binoculars and saw a tree fort 3 houses away with a gang member with a telescope and a walkie-talkie feeding information to several other little gangster wannabes who would then yell out what I was doing. It was a bit silly, but to hinder their surveillance I covered the whole backyard with landscaping tarp, and it actually made it nice and shady. It wasn't long and some stranger things started happening. As I sat in the camper one night I could hear some little punk gang members on the other side of the fence whispering, "What's he doing now?" I looked around in my small camper home to find out where they could possibly be watching me. The windows were all covered with boards drilled into the camper itself, a measure taken to keep them from breaking in while I was working as a painter. Picking up a tube of toothpaste and thinking that the only possibility was some kind of pinhole camera, I started dabbing small dots of toothpaste into any nail holes I perceived as a possible source. Outside the fence I could hear them burst out laughing. "He's putting toothpaste in nail holes," they said laughingly. That ended my living in the camper. I was too weirded out by the invasion of my privacy, and decided to sleep on a cot up by the front garage. During this time my dog had been killed as they kept letting it out while I was gone. She would be waiting by the gate when I arrived home. I had raised this dog from a puppy. She was a Timber Wolf Alaskan Malamute mix, but she leaned toward the wolf side. I had extension ladders covered with plywood and carpet that enabled her to access the roofs of the 2 garages that were within the fence. She was a good visual deterrent to anyone who didn't know her. The problem was she was friendly to a fault. She would bark at any stranger who wandered the alley at night, but if they would call out her name she would wag and whine for them to come in to pet her. She had been hit by a car on Euclid and Williamson, and I found her 2 streets over dead in someone's driveway. I buried her in the yard. At this point it was getting even worse. Gang members had broken into the owner's truck and stole his whole ring of keys, so they now had keys to all the garages and even his house. The owner, known as Japanese Jim, didn't realize the seriousness of the situation. I found just how serious it was when I had tried to ride my bike to a friend's house and a group of gang members around the age of 18-20 pointed at me as I rode by and yelled, "That's him, that's the guy." They all jumped in the truck and in the back of the pickup and tore off after me as I rode by. Before this event I had a series of nightmares where I would wake up drenched in sweat and literally shaking. These dreams were like no other nightmare I had ever had. The series of dreams were of me running from gang members and police, who seemed to be working together as a team to get me. Each time I would hide they would find me and the dream would end. The next night I would dream the same dream until I would get to the previous place, where they find me, and I would remember, no, they find me here. So in my dream I would continue running. This dream went on for several days, maybe even a week, and finally the dream concluded with me in the aqueduct, running from gang members and police. When I was unable to run anymore, I headed inside a drainage pipe and crawled into complete blackness at least 75 feet or more. I was unable to see the opening of where I came in fact it was black looking towards the entrance. In my dream I sat in the pipe hoping they would keep running by, but they had seen me jump the fence and slide down into the aqueduct. Once in the aqueduct you can't climb out until you come to a ramp where you can get back up the fence. Moments later I could hear voices directly in the pipe and I sat frozen, not moving a muscle. After about 15 minutes I hear what sounds like a metal pry bar prying up a manhole cover ahead of me and it being dragged off from an opening that I could not see. A huge burst of cool air shot down the pipe, and as I sat in the water it felt really good because I was sweating profusely. At the same time someone was advancing into the pipe, as I could hear the 4 inches of standing water being splashed as they crawled the pipe, and they kept getting closer and closer. It became dead silent for many minutes, and then I heard someone coming down the metal rungs of the ladder that was built inside the manhole. When they got to the bottom of the ladder I could hear someone making big swishing sounds in the water, almost like they were trying to kick the water down the pipe. Then someone yelled, "How many?" And the person at the entrance said none, and the swishing went on again. "How many?" They called out again. "None. He must be sitting in it," they said. I had no idea what they were doing. All I knew was after he said that the gang member advanced even further down the pipe and was about 10 feet away. Due to fatigue and the way I was sitting I needed to move my hand, and when I did my hand came down right on a dead leaf and it crunched. I heard, "You can come out the hard way or the easy way." I said, "I'll come out." I followed him out of the pipe as my eyes once again adjusted to sunlight. There were several gang members at the entrance and a police officer standing up at the fence. They boosted me up the wall and the cop grabbed me when I got over the fence and put handcuffs on me. But it was strange because in the dream he cuffed me in the front and they never do that. He put me in the back of the squad car and a gang member also got in the back seat and the cop drove to a nearby schoolyard where he got out and was talking to this older woman who looked like a gypsy. I asked the gang member who had retrieved me from the pipe, "How did you know I was in the pipe?" He said, "You left tracks from the water going up to the pipe. And we had someone go up ahead and pull the lid off and make waves in the standing water, and when we didn't see any ripples in the entrance we knew you were sitting in the water. Plus when they pulled the cover off I normally would feel a huge wind come down the pipe, but you were blocking the whole pipe with your body so I couldn't feel it." "Ah. That's what you're doing." "Well, for future reference," I said. "How could I hide in the pipe and you wouldn't know it?" He said, "You would need to straddle the water with your back up against the top of the pipe and allow the air to flow underneath you. And not stop the waves from telescoping to the end of the pipe." Just then the cop and the lady came up to the car. We were in a secluded area at the very end of the schoolyard. He opened the door and without saying a word he nodded at the gang member in the back seat as he grabbed a handcuff chain. The gang member grabbed me really tight around the waist as the officer pulled my arms toward the woman who, as I was watching, was removing a syringe from her purse and removing the cap of an already filled syringe of some unknown substance. I yelled, "What are you doing? Just relax, this is just to calm you down." "I am calm," I screamed as she stuck me with the needle. I knew instantly that I was given a deadly dose of something. And then I woke up. And I was literally shaking like a leaf. This was like no other dream I've ever had. I can remember it even today as clearly as if it happened. It was the next day that I would remember these dreams, because I was about to live them. I had just rode my bike through a few yards to escape a pickup truck that had gang members in it who began chasing me. As it sped away they tried to beat me around the block and cut me off. Soon I had ridden into a fenced yard and I ditched the bike, going over fence after fence on foot backyard to backyard. I stopped several times to hide only to get the craziest form of déjà vu I had ever known. "No, they find me here," so I would run again. It wasn't long and I had found myself running down the aqueduct. I ducked into the drainage pipe and was soon reliving the very dream I had just had the night before. I'm going to die, I thought. Just then the memory of what the gang member had told me came to my mind and I straddled the water with my back to the top of the pipe. Then everything was happening exactly as happened in my dream. The cover came off and the huge burst of air flowed as unhindered as possible down the pipe. Then the waves started to be kicked, only this time when he called out how many? I heard 5. And they would do it again and he would say the number again. Someone yelled, "He must be up ahead." But the guy in the pipe kept coming closer and closer. He was close enough I could smell his deodorant. I was literally quivering because my muscles were so tired of maintaining silence in such a precarious position. Eventually I had no choice. I had to move my hand to readjust and just like in the dream my hand came down on a leaf. Instantly I forced spit back and forth through my teeth, making a sound similar to a rat squeak. I took my 2 fingers and ran them on the side of the standing water, making the sound of a running rat going down the side of the pipe. That gang member was backing out of that pipe as fast as he could. He was convinced he had gotten right next to a rat. I could hear him confirming to his buddy that I must be further down the pipe and the entrance became silent. I slowly moved toward the entrance, peeking ever so slowly in every direction until I was sure it was clear. I began running down the aqueduct until I came to a ramp and got out, making it through back alleys and in between businesses until I finally made it home. Prior to this terrifying experience I had gone to work at Costco and we got out extra early. I didn't dare to go home at such a late hour, so I decided to sit in the B&B bakery on Harbor Boulevard and eat donuts and drink coffee until the sun came up. It was here that my predicament became even more dangerous as I sat next to the to-go window. I was dumbfounded at how many cars were out this time of the night making donut and coffee runs, but more interestingly they all ordered the same thing, small coffee 1 sugar. Each person would order the same thing. What are the odds, I thought, that's like the 10th car that ordered small coffee 1 sugar. Flabbergasted at this strange occurrence, the very next car that pulled to the window I blurted out, "Let's get small coffee 1 sugar." The look of the guy in the car and the looks everybody gave me in the entire bakery sent a shiver down my spine. They all looked at me with the most hate-filled eyes. Then suddenly it dawned on me the coffee pots were right in front of me. And each time this order was given the baker handed a small leaded coffee cup over the dividing wall to the girl who passed it out the window. Duh. They weren't getting a small coffee 1 sugar, they were getting drugs. Moments later 6 gang members came rolling in and were talking with the baker, and he was giving them instructions on how to disarm a person with a knife. It was apparently known that I was well acquainted with knives, as I was always carrying several throwing knives and railroad spikes that had been sharpened to a fine point. Knives might work well for someone about 20 feet away, but close quarter fighting 12 made me outnumbered. As they started to surround me, a new couple came in and the baker waved them off, not wanting to have any unknown witnesses. They moved to a table and leisurely drank their coffee, while I ordered another large coffee extra hot as another form of a weapon for fighting a group of attackers. I got out of there and fast. The buses had just started running, and I had taken out $1 and had it in my hand while watching the bus drive away. One of the gang members who was watching me intensely told the others he's gonna get on the next bus in Spanish. Thanks to working with Mexican painters I understand about every 3 words. After he said that, 3 of them took off, and I had a feeling where. Shortly a new bus rolled up out front, and it was my only chance as I was sitting in a gang-owned drugstore. I barreled out the door with 3 of them in hot pursuit, holding them off with the large hot coffee. I pushed the doors closed and screamed at the bus driver to drive as they began beating on the door with their fists. He was no dummy, he realized a fight would ensue, so he pulled away and started driving. I yelled at him to get on his phone and get the police to meet us at the next stop. At first he wouldn't do it, But when I told him he also would be a victim if he didn't, he made the right choice and had the police meet us a few stops down the road. Immediately after he made the call, I looked up and scanned the wide-eyed full bus load of passengers who were now fully alert from their early morning commute and probably wondering what the crazy white man was going to do next. 3 gang members were just a few seats back from the front. They had gotten on the bus 1 stop ahead of where I got on. It's funny how they stood out like a sore thumb. Ironically, they were the only ones with their heads down, not watching what was now completely riveting entertainment for the rest of the bus. So the police officer meets me at the bus stop and escorts me off the bus and asks me, "What's going on?" And I say, "Listen, I just discovered some illegal activity going on up the street, and now I got a gang chasing me." FTT, he growled. "This stands for Fullerton Tucker Town." I said yes. He looked both ways around him and in a low angry voice he snarled through his teeth, "If I were you, I'd shut my mouth." Another officer approached and said, "What's the problem, Joe?" Joe looked at me sternly, while his tone changed and he said, "I don't know what's the problem." Realizing that now I was in a real jackpot, I did what King David did when there was nowhere else to turn. I pretended I was losing my mind. I told the officers I think I'm having a delusion of some sort. This apparently made Joe very happy as he smiled and nodded approvingly. The other officer then made the suggestion that they should send me in for an evaluation. I agreed as I had no place else to go, and at this point there were several gang members across the street waiting patiently for whatever was going to be the conclusion for this drama. So the next thing I know, I was loaded, strapped down on a gurney in the back of an ambulance headed for a psychiatric hospital. In the ambulance I have a terrific view out the back door, and the first car behind us has a few gang members in it. The passenger puts his finger up to his mouth like you would to hush a child, SSHHHH, and then slides the finger like a knife across the front of his throat. They follow for a short ways and then peel off, making a turn. The next cars behind us all do the same thing. But in the last car the men were my dad's age, 60s, and they looked like mafia dons, and each car did the same little signal, so I kept my mouth shut. It was quite intimidating when I realized this wasn't punk kids anymore. After being interviewed and questioned, they gave me a mild sedative, and I was allowed to sleep, and boy did I need it. I slept all that day until the next morning, and they released me at 6 a.m. At this point I was rested, but man, I didn't know what I was going to do. I really had nowhere else to go. I think I had about $10 left in the whole world. I started toward a street trying to find a road sign to get an idea where they had taken me. As it turns out, I was on 1st Street in Santa Ana, right by Carl's Jr. I had painted many of these restaurants in Southern California. I found a bus stop right in front of the restaurant and decided I needed to at least get back to Fullerton. Just then I see this heavy-set, jolly sort of man coming down the sidewalk. The only way to describe him was he was a dead ringer for the character named Flounder in the movie Animal House. As he approaches he says, "Looks like we just missed this one," as he looked down the street. I followed his eyes just to see the back of a bus way down the street. Not wanting to talk to anyone and not being sure who he was anyway, I quickly mumbled, "Might as well get something to eat." "I think I will too," he said. "Oh, don't follow me," I screamed in my mind. As I opened the door, I turned only to find there was nobody there. It was quite perplexing. Where could such a fat man go so quickly, I thought. Relieved that he was no longer there, I surmised he went somewhere else to eat. Perhaps there was another restaurant he was looking at when he said, "I think I will too." It was early and nobody else was in the place, so I ordered my food at the counter. I was the only patron, so after getting my food I decided it might be better to wait inside for a bus instead of being a target for a drive-by shooting sitting at the bus stop. As I headed into the main dining area, my mouth just dropped and I was dumbfounded. There, sitting at a table in the middle of the restaurant, was Flounder. He was in a direct path of anyone who would be entering the dining room, and he already had a tray of food and was already eating. My mind was reeling, trying to figure out how he could have ordered food and got to a table without me seeing him, let alone even entering the restaurant ahead of me while I was standing at the door when he was behind me. "Why don't you join me?" he called out. Mentally I called him every name in the book, as I was not in any mood to engage anyone I didn't know with meaningless conversation. Then the strangest thing happened. My body, against my own will, began walking toward his table. My legs moved without my permission or any of my own reflexes. It was as if someone was controlling me with a remote control. The large man put out his hand and said, "Hi, my name is Bill," and before I had time to grasp what my legs and feet had just done, my arm now extended to shake his hand as my butt was forced into the seat directly across from him. I was not the one controlling any of it. Now I got to say I just left a psychiatric facility and no one is going to believe thee, but my body was under some weird power that had overridden my own mental control of my own body. There I was, completely speechless and basically stuttering out a mumbled sorta, "Hi. Bill?" Without skipping a beat he looks at me with piercing yet kind and gentle eyes and he says with a beaming smile, "I bet you are from Michigan." "Yeah, How do you know that?" He chuckled loudly and said, "Just a lucky guess." He continued, "I bet you have an older brother and an older sister." How do you know that?" I demanded. "Because I do have an older brother and sister." He laughed a big belly laugh. "Ha ha ha, just a coincidence," he stated. I was thinking, well, if you have any more lucky guesses or coincidences, I'm out of here because you're freaking me out. Then all of a sudden he started asking me when was the last time I talked with my parents. "Who is this guy?" I screamed in my head. I had not spoken to my mom and dad in 3 years. I wasn't living a life they would condone and I had cut off all ties with them. Then it got even weirder, if that was even possible. The man in front of me started answering the questions that I was thinking, not speaking, just thinking. I was thinking, why is this guy talking to me? Is he gay or something? And immediately he said, in answer to my thought, "I'm not gay." He mentioned some illness as to why he can't even have sex. He did this several times, me thinking a question and him answering it out loud. It was one of the weirdest experiences I ever had. His answers fit the conversation I was thinking perfectly. The only thing is I wasn't speaking anything. It must have looked like a one-sided conversation, me thinking and him answering. He kept talking about my need to talk to my parents, and how he was sure that they really loved me and missed me. I'm thinking, who is this guy? Wondering all the while what his angle was. Was he gay? Was he with the gang? Was he there to kill me, or scare me off? What? What I did know was he was dragging up deep emotions and I was having a hard time keeping my composure. Before I burst out in tears right in the middle of Carl's Jr., I said, "Well, I got to go, Bill," as I grabbed my empty tray and headed to the trash bin and out. He called after me, "Be careful," with a level of calm intensity that I wondered if he knew of my current predicament. Was I having a nervous breakdown? What was happening? As I basically walked out and started heading north, trying to avoid any path Bill would take, I must have walked 5 miles before sitting down and finally catching a bus. It was hours before I finally got back home. I decided to try to get to a friend's house who has some ties with the gangs, hoping he could help me defuse the predicament I was in. I was not new to the world of drugs and corruption, as I had once lived with a drug dealer who serviced the higher-end drug addicts such as judges and lawyers who would come to the house and do drugs and whatnot. Even got to stand before a judge whom I just did drugs with a week before. That works out well. It's a free get-out-of-jail-free card. But anyway, like most people who do drugs, their careers are ruined and the drugs take you down to the bottom to where you're living in a junkyard. On a personal note, I was not on drugs when all this occurred. Not that I didn't do drugs, but rather I had no drugs to do as I was broke. I was sitting on the cot by the fence just looking around the yard at all the junk, shopping carts full of miscellaneous metal pieces of every nature. As I looked under a shopping cart just sitting there pointing right at me was one of those computer balls with a camera. I leaned forward to get a better look, and suddenly dirt flew up into the air and this computer ball bounced across the sidewalk being pulled by the wire it was attached to, and it went down a hole. Grabbing a 5-gallon bucket of water I had filled for washing, I poured it down the hole. I hear the gang member yell from next door a bunch of curses and give a loud tally on how much he paid for his little spy device. I then grabbed a hose and began running water down the hole. It took about 10 minutes for it to fill up, and I heard cars running through water in the front of the house. I looked out the side gate and realized this water was making it all the way to the street in the front yard. I went into the garage and shut the door, locking myself inside and wondering if they have this space bugged too. Then I heard a voice say, "Rick." Now this was very strange to me because no one had called me by that name in 10 years. "Rick," it came again. "Who are you?" I answered, because this voice didn't seem to come from any direction. "I'm an angel, Rick." Oh no, I didn't want to hear that. That's it, I am losing my mind. I've finally lost it as I'm now hearing voices. "You're in a lot of trouble, Rick, and that's why I'm here," I said. "Of all the people on this earth, I am least deserving of an angel." "Well, you're right about that, but do you know how many people have been praying for you?" he said. "Oh no. Don't tell me that. I can't believe I'm talking to an angel," I said. "Well, it wouldn't be the first time," he said with a chuckle. At that moment his voice changed and I cried out. "Bill," he said. "Rick. There's no such thing as luck and no such thing as coincidence," reminding me of the lucky guesses about my family knowing where I was from. "Rick," he said, "a lot of people are praying for you, and I have to tell you that nothing moves an angel faster than the prayers of a little girl. Your nieces have been praying for you, and that's why I'm here." Well, that's all I could take. I fell on my face and started crying, my whole reality shattering before my eyes. I was experiencing the real reality of God's existence and the existence of His angels, and the false reality I had been living without Him was crashing to the ground before my very eyes. I didn't know if my little gang friends were listening or not, but Bill's words were moving my spirit to proclaim the gospel. What was happening to me is something not easily conveyed with words. Yet I knew in my heart I needed to confess the gospel, so stammering nervously because I knew that if the gang was listening they already knew how deep my sins were, much like their own. Feeling unworthy to even say these words, but my mouth began to confess the story of how God's Son Jesus came to earth and was crucified on the cross for our sins, and that those who repent and believe in Him will not perish but have eternal life. It was after this confession that a hand, again no words to describe how I knew it was a hand, but it was, reached inside my heart or soul and started pulling out what I can only describe as entities that I thought were part of my own psychological persona. These demonic entities began cursing me and frantically swearing at me as they were getting pulled out of me. They were so deeply woven into my whole being that they were part of me, it seemed. Because I had accepted their lies for most of my life, and they had been whispering these lies in my ears for a long time. They had spoken to me for so long in my mind that I accepted their voices as if they were my own. I actually felt like my mind was shattering because this experience was so supernatural and yet so real at the same time. These entities screamed as in one last-ditch effort to stay and make me believe the lies they had planted year after year. But as this was happening I could see their lies clearly. After being free of these things I looked up, and I can only describe it as looking up at a Montana night sky and seeing a trillion stars. The only difference was they weren't stars, they were my sins, and the sheer amount of my sins was staggering. But it wasn't just the amount of my sins, it was the depth and the breadth of each one also. I was given a grace to supernaturally understand each and every one of them and their individual blackness. There are no words to explain this experience other than it was like someone turned on the other 90% of my brain and I was able to fathom all my sins individually at the same time. It is said that when the world sees Jesus, every knee will bow and confess he is Lord. I truly believe this is what the whole world will experience, and let me tell you, the weight of each man's sin will drive them to their knees. It was so overwhelming that I began repenting and crying out to God how sorry I was. Every sin from a child to when I was 36 had been recorded, and it was awful. All I could do was cry, and I not only realized how great my sins were, but that this is what Judgment Day will be like for anyone who hasn't repented. When the weight of my sin was more than I could bear, I was crying and pleading with the Lord to forgive me. Suddenly my sins disappeared and I heard a different voice say, "I forgive you." Then an overwhelming joy just poured over me, a joy like I had never known in my entire life. I could be standing in front of a firing squad and it would not have diminished my joy in the least. In fact, I knew I was okay to die now. In fact, I thought this was the plan Bill had all along. With the greatest joy I started singing every Sunday school song I could remember, and I couldn't care less who heard me. Now I was still in Fullerton. I still had at least one, maybe two gangs after me, and I had caught the eye of a dirty cop, but none of that mattered to me now. I was completely at peace. Later that day, Ted, the owner's son, came into the backyard and said, "How would you like to go to Lake Michigan?" I just laughed and said, "Are you kidding me?" "I don't have any money," he said. "I'll pay your way. I have a jet ski competition, and I need someone to hold the back of the jet ski in the race." That night I sat in a chair in the middle of the yard under a big bright yard light. And I soon heard voices on the other side of the fence. And if it were any other day before that day, I would have been terrified at their discussion, but as it was, I just laughed out loud at their discussion. I heard them passing around a gun saying, "Here, you shoot 'em. No, you shoot 'em." The next day I left for Michigan. I have never been the same since. I have never again done drugs or drank alcohol since that day in the garage, when my life was changed forever. There are people who quit drugs and alcohol but live daily with cravings and longings. I don't even think about it. That's how free from drugs and alcohol I am. Whom the Son sets free is free indeed. I have been over 17 years clean and sober and following the Lord. May God be ever praised for His great mercy and grace on such a sinner as myself. I pray that He would finish the good work He has started and lead me down paths of righteousness.